All right, so thanks for joining everybody. Today is going to be, or this evening, depending where you are, is going to be exciting. We're going to go over the endocrine system, and Melissa's going to go over pretty much the lesson that is in the Smart Edition Academy online course. And there is a lot of information in here, and she's kind of prefaced with, this is going to be a difficult one because there is a lot of information for this system. And this is the one that's actually been the most requested from everybody in the Facebook group. Pretty consistently, everybody wants to talk about this system, and I think there's a lot of things around hormones and things like that, so it can definitely be a little tricky, and there is a lot there. So as we go through this, the format we're going to kind of take is to start off with a couple of practice questions, or maybe a practice question kind of within the lesson, and then we'll go through the lesson. And as you'll see in the lesson that's in the online course, it's sort of a little bit of some of the topics, and then some practice question, and then some topics and practice questions. So we'll just kind of follow that same format. If you have any questions, put them in the comments, and I will kind of try and moderate here and stop Melissa so that we can answer some of those. Feel free if you have questions to do that. And as we go through some of the practice questions, put your answers in there, and we'll kind of give it a second to pause and get everyone's answers. And then other than that, I think we should be ready to go. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa. If you have the Smart Edition book, this lesson for the endocrine system is in the book. It's also in the online course. So if you have that, pull it up. You can follow along. If you don't have it, Melissa's going to share her screen, so you'll be able to see it that way.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa. So today we're going to talk about the endocrine system, as you know already. I'm going to pull up the Smart Edition endocrine unit here. Okay, so the endocrine system. So we are going to look at the endocrine system and talk about what it is and the role it plays in the maintenance of homeostasis. All right, so what is the endocrine system? So it's a bit different from the other body systems that we know of that involve specific organs like the heart or the lungs. We know that, the cardiovascular system focuses on just the heart and how it works and how it, keeps us functioning. The endocrine system is instead made up of glands, and these glands produce hormones, and then those hormones are then sent into the blood. And basically, once it's sent into the blood, it causes certain reactions that occur in specific tissues. So, by doing this, the endocrine system works along with the nervous system to regulate the activities that are critical to maintaining our homeostasis. We'll talk a little bit about all that. So first, let's talk about homeostasis. All right. So homeostasis, it's basically the tendency toward a relative stable equilibrium between interdependent elements, especially maintained by physiological processes like the human body. Basically, the body needs to maintain homeostasis to remain stable and consistent. And we need this in order to function properly. Like our body temperature, normal body temperature is 98.6 degrees. If we go down to 94, you're going to be hypothermic, and there's going to be some issues going on. If it's too hot, say 105 degrees, then that's a fever, and we all know what fevers feel like. So basically, the endocrine system, or homeostasis, keeps the body in balance when something is off, or in this case, when a gland isn't functioning properly. That means the hormone's not going to be produced, and it's not going to be secreted accordingly, and it can cause dysfunctions within the body. And depending on the gland or the hormone, it depends on what's affected and how much of the body it affects. So here you see the functions of the endocrine system. So we know that it affects a large number of the body's functions. Let's review some of those functions. So maintaining water balance, the kidneys, help filter out fluids in the body. The body absorbs fluids and it gets rid of fluids. If we lose too many fluids, we can become dehydrated. Our body becomes, off balance. So the endocrine system kicks in there and works with the kidneys and the renals and, just really tries to get it back in balance. Body temperature, like we talked before, uterine contractions and milk production and milk release in females, growth, metabolism, tissue maturation, ion regulation, respiration, moods, heart rate and blood pressure regulation, blood glucose control. This could be, diabetes. If you have too much sugar in the blood, that's going to need to be regulated. It also helps control the immune system regulation. So if we get sick, how do we get better? How does our body get us better without, using medicine? It also affects reproductive function control and also sexual function. So there's lots of different systems that work with the endocrine system to help the body maintain balance. Okay, so now that we know all these all these functions, how does the body perform these functions? So basically, it's through chemical signals. These are also called ligands. And this is basically how hormones travel throughout the body and how they get used. So these chemical signals are also known as hormones, and they convey information from one part of the body to another distant part of the body. They are released from the endocrine cell into the extracellular environment, which means outside of the cell. And then they travel in the bloodstream to target tissues throughout the body. So let's talk about those chemical signals, the hormones. We have intracellular chemical signals. Here we are. Okay, back to those chemical signals. So intracellular chemical signals, these are produced in one part of the cell, say the cell membrane, and then they travel to another part of the same cell and bind to receptors in either the cytoplasm or the nucleus. Then we have intercellular chemicals, which are released from one cell, carried in the intercellular fluid, and bind to receptors that are found in other cells, but usually not all cells in the body. It's, with those target tissues, it only goes to certain cells. It's not going to go to every cell in your body. So just keep in mind that you should know what intracellular and intercellular means. So as adjectives, which are related to a noun that describes something, the difference between intercellular and intracellular is that intercellular is located between or connecting, while intracellular is inside of cell or within a cell. So now let's focus on those intercellular chemical signals. And they can be placed into functional categories based on the tissues from which they are secreted and the tissues that they regulate, which we will talk about later. So here you see we have autocrine chemical signals. These are released by cells and have a local effect on the same cell type. Okay. Paracrine chemical signals. These signals are released by cells and have effects on other cell types. Then we have neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. These signals are secreted by nerve cells and aid the nervous system. And then pheromones. These chemical signals are secreted into the environment and modify the behavior and physiology of other individuals. An example of that is if you've ever heard of when there's a lot of women around, it can, and they're around each other for a long time. Like say you're working in an office and there's lots of women there. Sometimes the menstrual cycle of those women can kind of regulate and be at the same time of the month. Pretty interesting. So now that we talked about those intercellular chemical signals, let's do this question. So which chemical signal would respond to the redness caused by an infected wound? A, autocrine, B, neuromodulators, C, paracrine, and D, pheromones. You can type your answer into the chat and then we'll check it.
So we got a couple answers for autocrine, a couple for paracrine, mostly autocrine. We had a C. Most everybody is piling in with A, autocrine. I think everybody has been paying attention pretty good if we've gotten this far and everybody's got the right answer.
All right.
All right, let's go ahead and check it.
Let's check A, autocrine. Correct. And as you can see up here and down here, these signals are released by cells and have a local effect on the same cell type. So an example of this is a prostaglandin-like chemical that's secreted in response to inflammation. So we're talking about the chemical signals, the categories, the prostaglandin-like chemicals, the somatostatin, acetylcholine. We'll get into that, but we're just talking about the basics right now. Okay. So now we have receptors. So we have the signals. So, the hormone sent out a signal. Now what? The signals will bind to proteins or glycoproteins, which are called receptor molecules, in order to produce a response. The shape and the chemical characteristics of each receptor site allows only certain chemical signals to bind to it. And this is called specificity. Okay. So here's just a picture of it. This is the receptor. And here's the ligand or hormone or the chemical signal, which we talked about before. So there's two major types of receptor molecules that respond to an intercellular chemical signal. Remember, before we were talking about intercellular chemical signals in particular, which are these guys right here. Okay, these guys. Now, what are the major types of receptor molecules that connect with those intercellular guys? Okay, we have intracellular receptors. These receptors are located in either the cytoplasm or the nucleus of the cell. And the signals diffuse across the cell membrane and bind to the receptor sites on intracellular receptors. Okay, so all different types of receptors and proteins and whatnot kind of fit like a puzzle piece. So that's why they're not going to just connect and combine to any receptor within the body. Okay. Another major type is the membrane-bound receptors. These receptors extend across the cell membrane with the receptor sites on the outer surface of the cell membrane. And they respond to intercellular chemical signals that are large, water-soluble molecules that do not diffuse across the membrane. Okay. So when an intercellular signal binds to a membrane-bound receptor, there's three general types of responses that can happen. We have receptors that directly alter a membrane permeability. So an example of this is acetylcholine, which is also known as adrenaline. Adrenaline is, say, I don't know, say you see a squirrel across the street, you're in the street and you just kind of, I don't know if this is a really good example, but in a stressful situation, your body kind of has that rush of adrenaline. So that happens because of hormones in the endocrine system. Okay. And then we have receptors and G proteins. A G protein, which are found in the inner surface of the plasma membrane, and function as a receptor of a hormone. An example of this is a chemical signal, including, work with me here, cyclic adenosine monophosphate glycerol, or inositol triphosphate, and they bind to receptor molecules in the cell, and they alter their activity to produce a response. For these type of things, I would say, know the basics. You do not, at this point in time, and I'm a nurse practitioner, I can tell you I've never needed to know this by heart. Okay. You just want to know the basics. Like what are these three general types of responses for of a receptor molecule when it connects with that intercellular signal. Okay, and the third type of response that can happen is that receptors that alter the activity of enzymes. This is basically increasing the activity of an enzyme responsible for the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, and it makes glucose available as energy source for muscle contractions. Okay, so
does this all make sense for everybody? Do you guys have any questions on that? There's quite a few things in there that are really a mouthful. So just want to make sure everybody's kind of still hanging and following and not too confused and kind of follow those three items.
Yeah, it can get tricky because there's a lot of pieces to it, but I would say, just like this chapter study guide here, you break it down, start in the beginning. What is the endocrine system? What does it do? How does it function? Why does it do that? And what is it achieving? And then you get into the more specifics of different types of hormones, et cetera. So just, I know it is a mouthful, but you just got to take it slow and, read it at your own rate and just, write things down, read things, watch videos, just really take it in on the best way that works for you. And
would you say, Melissa, this is one of the harder systems in A&P, and kind of if it is, why?
It is because it's, like I mentioned before, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, it's pretty like black and white. You have the heart, how the blood gets to the heart, we know how the blood leaves the heart, we know how it flows through the heart, and we know what happens when it doesn't work. We know how it works, etc. Where the endocrine system is so complex that you aren't going to need to know everything. Okay, I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the ends, but unless you're an endocrinologist, which is the doctor who studies the endocrine system, you just want to know the basics, especially when you're taking this test, because there's so many systems to learn. You're not going to know everything right away. Okay, when you start practicing, when you're in the field, if you're a nurse, wherever you go, you're going to learn more. Okay, so you don't need to know everything, but you just want to get a general understanding of the basics of how things work, what it is, and what happens if it doesn't work.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's why we got so many requests for this system. It seems to be one that people struggle with. So everybody, I'm curious in the chat, how do you guys feel about the endocrine system compared to other systems that you've been studying? Are you guys finding it more difficult, confusing, Susie Q says, and just kind of curious what your guys' feedback is on this, and just to even let the other students in this study group kind of get an idea of how everybody feels about it. Feel free to drop that in the. So I don't know if you guys want to, we can definitely keep going, but what do you guys find confusing about it, like particularly? And maybe Melissa can add some clarity to, so someone's saying kind of there's a lot to identify, it's overwhelming. And I think that's kind of what Melissa's trying to drive home. It is overwhelming, but you don't need to know, those 9-syllable words necessarily. But we do know that hormones are definitely something that pops up, particularly on the TEAS test, the HESI, the Kaplan nursing exam. So I know hormones is definitely something to pay attention to, and I think we'll definitely be touching on that here. Yeah, so someone else is kind of asking, very overwhelming. What do we need to study to be exact? And that's kind of a hard question to answer.
Yeah. So with any sort of board certifying test or, say standardized tests like the TEAS or the NCLEX. So if you take the TEAS to get into nursing school, then you take the NCLEX when you leave nursing school to become, a licensed nurse. If you go beyond that, nurse practitioner, you have to take your boards on whatever your specialty is. And yes, you have to study everything that has been taught to you. And of course, you're not going to be tested on everything. Basically, the endocrine system is not a specific organ. It's glands throughout the body. It's not just in one spot of the body, it's in all over the body. And those glands secrete hormones, and those hormones are secreted based on keeping the body in balance. And it's not just one gland, and it's not doing just one thing. It's multiple glands doing different things, keeping our body in check. So once we know that, we need to know how this works. So when you're studying, you want to break it down. We talked about the chemical signals, which are hormones. Okay, and that's going to send the information from one part of the body to the other part of the body, telling it, hey, something's off. We need to do something about it. You have intracellular chemical signals and intercellular chemical signals. This particular system, we are talking about the intercellular chemical signals, and we look at their functional categories. There's 4 of them here. Right, then we have those signals, and once we have that signal, what's it going to do? It's going to bind to something. All right, it's going to bind to a receptor molecule as a response, and then once that receptor molecule connects with the signal, something's going to happen. So what's going to happen? It's going to be a response. And there's 3 general types of responses that happen when the chemical signal connects with that the receptor molecule. So 1, we have the receptors that directly alter membrane permeability. So we have receptors that directly alter membrane permeability. Then another response, when the chemical signal and the receptor molecules connect, we can have receptors and G proteins. And then we have the receptors that alter the activity of enzymes, right? Let's do this question. Okay. So a friend is changing the tire on her car and the jack breaks. Her hand is caught under the car. A passerby notices, runs over, lifts the car off of her hand. What type of intercellular signal has responded? Okay. A, receptors and G proteins. B, receptors that alter the activity of enzymes. C, receptors that directly alter membrane permeability. And D, receptors that indirectly alter membrane permeability.
We got a couple different answers here. We got a few folks with answer B, the receptors that alter the activity of enzymes, and most folks are going with C. So still a few more coming in here. So it's going to be between B and C. This is definitely a tricky one.
Okay.
Go ahead, Melissa, what is the answer to this question?
Okay. The answer is C. Receptors that directly alter membrane permeability. Okay. So these are the 3 types of responses. And the question is asking what type of intercellular signal is responded.
So there was only really these 3 options, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the answer is C.
What's the explanation for this?
Okay. So, well, first I want to just talk about when you're doing these questions in whichever test you're taking, is slow down. I know a lot of times you may be a little bit nervous. Your time is running out. You're rushing through. You want to read what's being asked and, really read carefully what the options are. So this one specifically, there's 3 options that it could be, but they've thrown a 4th one in there. And there's a keyword here, directly or indirectly. Okay. So you want to just remember that there are the 3 types of responses. And, as you start to cross answers out there, you're like, I know that's definitely not it. you could cross this one out completely. I know it doesn't indirectly alter the membrane permeability. Okay, so oh, let's go here. Let's check it. So I just wanted to, so some of the intracellular chemical signals will diffuse across cell membranes and bind to intracellular receptors. Because these intracellular chemical signals are relatively small and soluble in lipids, they can diffuse through cell membranes. The chemical signal and the receptors bind to DNA in the nucleus and increase specific messenger RNA synthesis in the nucleus of the cell. Messenger RNA then moves to ribosomes and cytoplasm where new proteins are produced. A lot of times when you're learning and, once you get into nursing, you're not going to get this in depth into the endocrine system. You're not going to really talk about what's going on in the cell, in the nucleus specifically. But, just trying to learn the basics of it. In contrast, intercellular chemical signals that bind to membrane-bound receptors produce rapid responses. So that's what we're talking about here. It's a rapid response to someone lifting the car up, okay? So for example, a few of the intercellular chemical signals can bind to their membrane-bound receptors, and each activated receptor can produce many intracellular chemical signal molecules that rapidly activate many specific enzymes inside the cell. Okay, we could stay on that forever, but let's talk about more about the hormones, okay, which are very important as well. So a hormone is an intercellular chemical signal that's produced in very small amounts by collections of cells to influence the activity of specific tissues in a specific way. All right, so the hormones are produced by glands, and then they're sent into the bloodstream to various tissues in the body. And like I said earlier, only to certain tissues, not all tissues or any tissue. And these specific tissues are called target tissues. And in those target tissues, respond to a specific type of hormone. And they will send signals to those tissues. So the hormones will send the signals to those tissues to tell them what they are supposed to do. When a gland does not produce the right amount of a hormone, so say the gland there's a dysfunction with the gland and it's producing too much or too little or a hormone, a disease or dysfunction can develop, and it can affect many aspects of life. So how do hormones get secreted, and how do they know when it's the right time? So their secretion is controlled by a negative feedback mechanism, which is kind of similar to the homeostasis, which we talked about earlier. Okay, so a negative feedback mechanism controls the secretion of hormones, and it's found in homeostatic systems like humans. And like we mentioned before, it is to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. So when there's a change, when there's a stimulus or a change in the environment, the feedback loops as a response to keep the systems functioning to a near set point, an ideal level. It may not be perfect, but at least it's within that okay range of functioning properly. All right, so hormones are secreted. The hormone secretion is regulated in 3 different ways. So we have blood level of chemicals, which the secretion of hormones is directly controlled by the blood levels of certain chemicals. An example of this is blood glucose levels, which control insulin secretion. If there's too much glucose in the blood, insulin, more insulin is going to be secreted. Some people who have, say, type 1 diabetes, which means the pancreas, which is a gland that's secreting insulin, isn't functioning properly. And that's why those blood glucose levels are out of sorts. And insulin needs to be given externally to make it work. There's also their hormone secretions can be regulated also by other hormones. So for example, hormones from the pituitary gland act on the ovaries and the testes, causing those specific organs to secrete sex hormones. And then the nervous system, an example of that is when epinephrine is released as a result from a nervous system stimulation. So kind of that fight or flight response, that's part of the nervous system, and it's going to secrete that adrenaline and the epinephrine to really get things going. All right, so we have another question here. The negative feedback mechanism that regulates the level of glucose in a person's blood is an example of what type of hormone secretion regulation? Is it A, hormone regulation, B, nervous system regulation, C, blood levels of chemical regulation, or D, intercellular ion concentration regulation?
Okay, I want to see what you guys think in the chat. We've got mostly C. So let's see what we think. A couple more C's. Let's see. We have at least 50 or 60 people in here, so I'd like to see some more answers. Pretty unanimous, though, what I'm seeing in here so far. C, blood levels of chemical regulation. Okay, it looks like pretty much everybody is on the same page here, that it is blood levels of chemical regulation. And let's see why that answer is correct.
Okay. Now let's talk about endocrine glands and their secretions, which are the hormones. So this table here are hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. I'm just going to go over a few things. You can see this chart here. There's another one here. There's many different glands and many different hormones that they secrete in many different target tissues that they have. So this is, you're not going to learn all this right now. This is what you're going to want to really focus on, the thyroid gland. What is it? Where is it? What does it secrete? What hormone is it responsible for? Where does it, what part of the body does it affect? What response does it give when it works properly? What response does it do when it doesn't work properly? If there's too much or too little, okay? So let me just go over a few of them. So the endocrine system has endocrine glands and they secrete hormones. The whole endocrine system consists of ductless glands that secrete hormones directly into the blood. So there's an extensive network of blood vessels that supply hormones for the endocrine glands. So a few of the main hormone producing glands are the pituitary gland. Let's see if we have it on here. It might not be in here. This is not a full list here, but it's a pretty popular list. There's a lot of smaller glands and smaller hormones that you don't always hear about, but let me just go over some of them. So the pituitary gland it's a small bean-shaped, almost like a pea-sized gland located at the base of your brain. So it's somewhat behind your nose and between your ears, and it's considered the master control gland. and it controls other endocrine glands. And the pituitary gland secretes several different hormones. Some of the hormones that it secretes, not all of them. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, which regulates fluid balance in the body. It regulates follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH, which stimulates the ovaries to produce eggs or ova in women and sperm production in men. It also controls growth hormone, which stimulates growth during childhood and maintains bone and muscle mass in adults. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, helps regulate testosterone in males and estrogen in females. Oxytocin, which stimulates lactation, like milk production in breasts, and the contraction of smooth muscles of the uterus during childbirth. That's why if you've ever, someone has been induced, they get, Pitocin, it kind of helps mimic oxytocin to start getting contraction started. It controls prolactin, which is a hormone that stimulates milk production after birth in females, mothers. And it also, another one is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, which stimulates thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones that regulate metabolism and blood calcium levels. And also when I'm saying, growth hormone, GH, FSH, ADH, LH, TSH, you're going to see these abbreviations on blood tests. So hormone levels are monitored through blood tests. And if you're ever going over them and reading them, you're going to see them as TSH, T3, 4. So they all mean certain hormones that's being tested for. So that's the pituitary gland, responsible for many things. Then we have the hypothalamus, which is located on the undersurface of the brain, just below the thalamus and above the pituitary gland. It also assists the pituitary gland in regulating other glands by releasing hormones that it communicates with. Hypothalamus is responsible for body temperature, hunger, moods, thirst, sleep, and sex drive. And some of the hormones that it releases are dopamine, which tells the body, or tells the pituitary gland to produce less prolactin. The gonadotropin releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary to secrete FSH hormone, and the LH hormone. The growth hormone releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary gland to secrete growth hormone. So the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to do a lot of things. Another gland is the pineal gland, and this gland is the major site of the body's melatonin production, which helps regulate sleep cycles and also influences sexual development. And that's also located in the brain, in the middle of the brain, actually. Then we have the thyroid. Thyroid is really, really important. You're going to always read about thyroid. So definitely know thyroid and the pituitary. So the thyroid, it's located in the anterior, which is in the front part of your neck, basically, just below the Adam's apple, or in front of the trachea, below the larynx. It's a butterfly shaped, and it helps regulate body's metabolism, which is, how the body gets energy from food, and also blood calcium levels by secreting 3 hormones: calcitonin, thyroxine, and teodothyrone. Mouthful. So definitely know thyroid. Very important gland. Then there's the parathyroid gland, which there are 4 small parathyroid glands located on the thyroid. They secrete parathyroid hormone, which raises calcium levels in the blood. And they work together with the thyroid gland to keep blood calcium at just the right level. Some other glands is the thymus. This gland is located in the thoracic cavity, posterior, which is behind the sternum, which is kind of that breastbone right down the middle. It's part of the immune system, and it's made of lymphoid tissue. The function of this thymus gland is to take immature T cells, which are a type of white blood cell, and develop them into mature T cells that are capable of recognizing foreign substances that may cause damage to the body. Okay, so thymus, important part of the immune system. And then we have the pancreas, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's a long, flat gland that lies horizontally behind your stomach. Part of the pancreas makes digestive enzymes, but another part of it makes insulin, which is the hormone that helps regulate carbohydrate metabolism and fat storage. It's secreted after a person consumes carbs, like a starch or sugar. And like I was talking about before, people who can't make insulin have a condition called type 1 diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes either don't make enough insulin or can't use insulin properly. So that's why type 1 diabetes, it's usually a lifelong condition, where type 2 diabetes often can be eliminated through lifestyle change. There's also gestational diabetes, which occurs during pregnancy and goes away once the baby's born. Diabetes in general results in an elevated blood sugar level and can cause the person to feel thirsty or hungry more frequently than usual. They'll also urinate a lot. So that's what type 1 diabetes, if it's not usually diagnosed at birth, it usually takes a few years. So in children, some of the early signals are increased thirst, increased urination, fruity breath, a sweet urine smell. So those are things that trigger people to have them tested, and you can test the blood, the urine for any glucose or sugar in either the blood or the urine. Let's see. So yeah, depending on the type and severity of disease, treatment includes insulin injections, medications that can regulate the glucose levels, or dietary interventions. Gestational diabetes, usually you find out later on in the pregnancy, and it's more of a controlled situation with diet, and then it goes away usually. Another gland is the adrenal gland, also known as the suprarenals, which are small triangular shaped glands located on top of both kidneys. These glands produce hormones that control sex drive and cortisol, the stress hormone, metabolism, immune system, and blood pressure, to name a few. That's not an extensive list. So some of the hormones that the adrenal glands secrete are aldosterone, cortisol, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and sex hormones. Then we have the ovaries, which are only in females. The ovaries secrete estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone, which is the female sex hormone. There's two small oval-shaped organs in the pelvis, in the lower abdomen, which is where the ovaries are. And then the testes, they're located in males only. The testes produce the male sex hormone, testosterone, and produce sperm. And the testes lie behind the penis in a pouch of skin called the scrotum. They move freely within the scrotum, but each testis is attached to the body wall by a thin cord called the spermatic cord. Okay, so those are just a few glands and hormones that they produce. So I would definitely focus on glands and the hormones they produce. the ones you see here is not a full extensive list because there's hundreds, but these are very important ones, the more common ones that you will see. So definitely know these here.
I know we had someone in the chat ask what this material was from, and it is from the Smart Edition Academy online course. So let's go ahead and finish this out. I think everybody has about an hour in, and our brains start to melt a little bit if we get too much farther beyond that without kind of breaks. So let's go ahead and finish it out, and I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay. So now that we know the basics of the endocrine system and how it works, sometimes it does not work so well. And if there's something that's not working well in the endocrine system, it doesn't mean every single gland and every single hormone is affected. It could just be the thyroid. It could just be the thymus. So just keep in mind that sometimes it doesn't work so well, and sometimes it's just parts of the endocrine system, not the whole system that's affected. So some factors that affect the endocrine organs include aging, like you see here, also some certain diseases and conditions, stress, environment, and genetics, of course. So aging, let's talk about aging specifically. It affects hormone activity. So despite age-related changes, the endocrine system functions usually pretty well in most older people, but the aging process itself can, and often does affect the hormone activity. So, it usually happens in one of three ways. Either their secretion can decrease, they can remain unchanged, or it can increase. So these changes often occur because of either damage to cells during the aging process or medical issues that the aging body accumulates or genetically programmed cellular changes. So some of these changes can alter hormone production and secretion. Maybe, like I said before, it can decrease. So here, right here, look at this table. So with aging, we have hormone production and secretion, hormone metabolism, hormone levels circulating in blood, target cell or target tissue responses, rhythms in the body, such as the menstrual cycle. So these are all things within the body that can be affected with older age. So as you see here, the growth hormone decreases. So muscle mass decreases. So, you're not, maybe when you were 20, you were a bodybuilder and you had huge muscles, and, as you get older, those muscles aren't maintained as well, or kind of decrease because that growth hormone isn't functioning properly. So let's see. Okay, so we were talking about, what's the secretion shift from aging and the hormones. We talked about the decrease. There's some that, thyroid, insulin, cortisol, generally they remain unchanged with aging. That doesn't mean that they won't change. There could always be, for example, thyroid again. Someone may have a perfectly normal thyroid their entire life, but say genetics, say maternal grandma had hypothyroidism, which means low functioning low functioning thyroid. So, and genetics play a role with that, and say, when you turn 60, your thyroid may not start working so well. That's, an example of not necessarily because of the older age, but genetics. So there's different things that can cause things to change, but just aging in general, it will generally remain unchanged. And then there's some, hormones that will increase with age. FSH, LH hormone, parathyroid, norepinephrine, epinephrine are some examples. So women specifically, I'm sure you've all heard of menopause before, but aging affects a woman's ovaries, which results in menopause, usually between 50, 55 years of age. And in menopause, the ovaries stop making estrogen and progesterone, and they no longer have a store for eggs. And when this happens, menstrual periods stop, because as you know, females have a menstrual period because that's when the egg is released into the fallopian tubes and it goes into the uterus. And if that egg is not fertilized, that's when it passes through, and that's when the period or the shedding of the uterus lining kind of sheds, and that's the bleeding part. So once those hormones, estrogen, progesterone, aren't functioning anymore, there's a decrease, then all of that stuff is not, the ovaries aren't going to be released, there's not going to be a menstrual period, etc. Also in men, testosterone levels usually decrease gradually. It's not just a one-time thing. There's also, with aging, there's decreased melatonin levels, and these may play an important role in the loss of a normal sleep-wake cycle, also known as circadian rhythms, with aging. Right here. Another example is that with increasing age, it is thought to be related to the development of type 2 diabetes, especially in people who might be at risk for this disorder. So type 2 diabetes can also affect young people as well. It's increasingly affecting children as well. So often, not often, but it can affect older individuals that may have decreased lifestyle activities, may not run as much, walk as much, and more sedentary lifestyles, causing weight gain, which can cause type 2 diabetes. Not necessarily because they're older, but because things change as they've gotten older. So as you can see, the aging process affects nearly every gland. It affects every individual differently, and certain health-related or environmental factors, genetics, can increase or enhance the changes that occur.
Does this all make sense? You guys have any questions on that? Drop them in the chat. If you do, that's quite a bit of information. And then we'll go to this practice question. But go ahead and read the practice question. If you guys have any questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and get to this practice question.
Which of the following is an effect of aging on hormone secretion? Weak teeth, B, loss of appetite, C, trouble sleeping, or D, loss of body hair?
We have a lot of C as the answer. Nope, everybody's got C. So those are still coming in. C, trouble sleeping, and go ahead and lay it on us. What is the answer?
Let's try trouble sleeping. Correct. All right, because melatonin, as we saw up here, is a hormone that is decreased in aging, is an effect of aging, and can affect how well we sleep. If our melatonin levels are low, we're probably not going to sleep as well. And this answer here has a little bit more in-depth information about different changes. And just to finish up with that aging part, aging, it's not only, aging is not the only time hormones and glands can be affected in a person's life. It can happen at any time. It can happen to children. It can happen to babies. And if there's issues or concerns, people will be referred to an endocrinologist, which is in the field of endocrinology. And these doctors specialize in the endocrine system specifically. So if there's something wrong, you're likely going to see an endocrinologist to figure out what's going on and to determine your best treatment, long-term, short-term, and goes from there. And so overall, the endocrine system can seem tricky. There's definitely a lot of parts, glands, hormones, receptors, tons of different stuff. And it's important to know and understand the basics. At this point in time, you're not studying to be an endocrinologist. You're likely studying to go into nursing school. So study the basics, try to understand the basics. You don't have to go into the deep depths of the 9-syllable hormones and specific parts of the cell and whatnot. You just focus on the basics, the more common stuff, and that's likely what they're going to be testing you on at this point in time.
Okay, cool. All right, so I think that brings us to the end of the lesson. Do you want to go over these let's review bullets, and just guys, these are going to be the most important parts from this lesson. And below that, if you have the course, you also have all the flashcards for this system, so you can check those out as well. But let's just go through these bullets, and then I think we can wrap it up. So Melissa, take us away, and let's do this final review on these most important parts for this system.
Okay, so the endocrine system functions with the nervous system to really regulate many activities critical to the maintenance of homeostasis. So always remember what homeostasis means. Remember about that negative feedback mechanism. Why does the body want to, why do we want our body temperature to stay at 98.6? What happens if it goes too low? What if it goes too high? Why does our body need to keep it at that 97, 98 range? Okay. We talked about the chemical signals or ligands, or also known as hormones, which are molecules that are released from one location and move to another location in the body to produce a response to that receptor molecule. The chemical signals bind to proteins or glycoproteins called receptor molecules to produce a response. A hormone, the response is a hormone, is an intracellular chemical signal. No, I'm sorry. The hormone is that intracellular chemical signal that's produced in small amounts to influence an activity on specific tissues. So the hormone is the chemical system that is going to bind to a receptor molecule to produce a response. So, hey, our thyroid is not producing enough thyroid hormone, so we need to do something about it. We need to target those specific tissues within the body. And, if we're too little of a thyroid hormone, we're going to have to increase it to get it back to that homeostasis, that equilibrium, to make it function normally. Hormones are distributed in the blood to all parts of the body, but remember, only certain tissues, those target tissues. It's not going to go to every single part of the body. It's going to go, it's going to respond, certain tissues are going to respond to specific hormones. The negative feedback mechanism, like I mentioned, and, the endocrine system consists of ductless glands, and they secrete hormones directly into the blood. And the aging process affects hormone activity. Getting older doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to stop working. It's just going to, things slow down a little bit. Muscles are going to decrease. Melatonin may decrease. Certain sex hormones may decrease. And then, the body finds a new normal at that point in time.
All right, cool. So that is the whole lesson. So let me just actually drop a link in the chat now. If any of you are not in the Facebook group, I would highly suggest doing that. Lots of good resources there. So I just put a link, although I sent that directly to Alejandro. So let me just make it public for everybody. So there's the link there. I think most of you guys are in already, but if you're not, go ahead and check that out. And then please, if you're in the group, please make posts and help everybody out. If you're finding good resources, please do that. If you found this helpful, let Melissa know, give her a shout out. She's doing this. She's actually almost 5 months pregnant. So we're keeping her up here pretty late, and she's kind of powering through this, but so she's going to go and get a good night's sleep now. So cool. All right. So guys, we appreciate it. And we will go ahead and sign off, and we will let you know when the next tutoring session happens. next week, the week after, one of those days. And again, we'll post in the Facebook group, and we want to get all you guys feedback on the times, on the days, on the topics, all that stuff. We're doing this for you guys to help you guys out. So do that. And then if you guys don't have the online course, you can check that out. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye.